Welcome to this special episode of AU Manufacturing Conversations, which is part of our annual Australia's 50 Most Innovative Manufacturers campaign. This time around, the 50 Most Innovative has been made possible through the support of these wonderful sponsors: Australia Wide Engineering Recruitment, TXM Lean Solutions, the Industry Capability Network, Bonfiglioli Australia, the Advanced Manufacturing Growth Centre, and the SmartCrete CRC. If you're interested in nominating, please see a link in the episode details. It's completely free to be a part of this campaign and always will be, and we'll be celebrating the announcement of the 50 Most Innovative list and the award winners at a special breakfast event on May 7 at Crown Melbourne during Australian Manufacturing Week. Now on with the show. Warren, thank you very much for joining us here on AU Manufacturing Conversations. It's lovely to have you on the program.
Thanks for having me.
A pleasure. Glad you said yes. So let's get going in standard fashion, and that is with the standard opening question, which is, how did you get here and what do you make?
Well, my background is a material scientist, PhD in semiconductors, and then I did a business degree, and I've been starting companies pretty much ever since I did the business degree. What we make is clean fusion energy using boron as a fuel. So this is done with big lasers, and as a company, we've recently branched out into developing, and we hopefully will be making manufacturing lasers in the not too distant future.
I had a bit of a snoop on your LinkedIn, as people do when they are about to talk to other people, and it looks like quite a big chunk of your life is devoted to the task of commercializing research. Everyone I've spoken to who does that says it's an enormously frustrating challenge. Why have you decided to do that? And tell me a little bit, I guess, further than that about it looks like there may be more ventures that you're heading up.
Yeah, okay. Well, starting with the other ventures, some ventures that I've developed in the past. My very first one was a lithography technique using diamond. So that was when I was overseas in Ireland, and that company is called Adama Innovations. I've helped develop a gene therapy company, which was very, very different from a material science perspective, and also Advanced Alloy Holdings, which is commercializing high entropy alloys between copper and some precious metals and some iron-based ones. I've helped start those. My focus day to day is fusion. Fusion is a busy job, and there's a lot of work to do. But commercialization, I guess I had a moment during my business degree when someone told me that the reason people do research is to file patents and claim a monopoly on an industry. And as a scientist, that didn't really make sense for me. But the penny dropped that very, very few people realize or understand how to commercialize any technology. But in the Australian context, Australia is famous for being, one of the highest performing countries as far as research outputs. There's a problem that there's very, very few people know how to do this. But if you consider all economic growth that has ever been, it's all through the commercialization of a technology. So that's where I dedicated my career to that gap, understanding science and trying to bring it to the benefit of the world.
This interview is, I promise, focused on HB11, which I know you're eager to talk about, but a few other things before we get there. Another thing I saw when I was snooping your LinkedIn bio is that you spent some time at ANFF, which is a wonderful national resource, and there's a figure there about lifting industry usage by quite an impressive amount. I think it was a high 20% per year on average. Is there a secret, if you will, to getting industry to make better use of such important resources that we have?
Yeah, well, to briefly introduce ANFF, there's about $500 million worth of micro and nano fabrication infrastructure that's available as a service. Now, the greater manufacturing industry use that, not as widely, in my opinion, as they could. But the secret to getting people to use that is to really understand the benefits. So what that meant is understanding the people who use it largely from the academic community and what benefits and innovations they're bringing about, and then translating that into a company's understanding of how that could benefit from them. So the short answer is science communication, the ability to be able to translate an interesting, innovative bit of science into something that will benefit another company. I guess one of my other quirks of that job was, well, if you're not interested in this, there's plenty of your competitors who might be. Always is a good nudge, particularly for the Australian manufacturers.
FOMO's a powerful thing, regardless of who you are.
Absolutely.
On to, as promised, HB11. Your co-founder, Heinrich Hora, is quite, from what I've read, a grand old man of theoretical physics in Australia. Tell me about how you linked up with him and what's so special about his work.
So Heinz, he, in my opinion, was one of the greatest physicists that Australia will see. When I met Heinz, I didn't know this at the time. So I was working in ANFF and I met Heinz trying to find my chairman, Chris Fell. Chris Fell previously was the DVCR of UNSW for quite a long time, including when Heinz was in some of the better part of his career. Heinz was promoting some scientific advances in his field. Now, at the time, he is in his 80s. He couldn't concentrate on those on his own, but he was making the point that they're very, very significant and someone needs to look at them. What those results were in the field of laser fusion, a few groups, not with billion-dollar budgets, but regular labs with some nice laser facilities, were getting fusion reaction rates about 1 million times higher than is expected. Now, Heinz's career was dedicated to plasma physics and in particular how to make hydrogen boron fusion work. Heinz has identified that there was some unknown science that was leading to those results and that someone needs to look at this because there's a potential for an unlimited source of energy. At the time, I said, look, Heinz, I know you're looking for Chris, but do you mind if I have a look? I dedicated quite a few months into understanding Professor Hora's work and whether it's valid, including getting my opinion from Chris about, is this legitimate or is this crazy physics? Came to the conclusion that this is a real scientific development that is worthy of looking at, in particular in a time where the world is begging for carbon-free energy sources. I guess once I got to know the field, what I didn't realize is how important his work was. He really defined the field of laser fusion at large. He made a bunch of the major discoveries in the field, including laser ion acceleration, the ability to create a compressed target that could lead to fusion. Also, of course, hydrogen boron fusion. He also started the community, which is now the biggest conference in its field. And this community were the ones who were credited for the US National Ignition Facility achieving a burning plasma and net energy gain in fusion. So absolutely, he's the grandfather of this field.
For those who are unfamiliar with the subject, you've just said a little about fusion, but let's go back a little way and let's hear about nuclear fusion. What is it and how does HB11 do it, and what are some other ways?
Fusion is a new way of creating energy. Unlike fission, which is splitting atoms, fusion is forcing atoms together. Now, the common denominator between fission and fusion is the energy density, if the energy can be extracted, is about the same. So that's around about 10 million times higher than fossil fuels. The key difference between fission and fusion is much cleaner than fission. So there are a few different fuel candidates for fusion. They're all light elements like hydrogen, boron, helium. In the case of HB11, the fuels are hydrogen, regular everyday hydrogen, which is in water and makes up most of our body and the air that we breathe, and boron. So boron is a very abundant material. It's safe. You can buy it from Bunnings to fertilize your garden. It's cheap. It's clean. When we fuse it, it creates no neutrons. That means no radioactive waste, but we still preserve all the benefits of energy density. But probably the other point, and this is a distinction between other fusion fuels, in particular deuterium and tritium, the actual amount of supply of hydrogen and boron 11 could supply the world's energy needs for about 10,000 years with known resources. So essentially, it is a clean, virtually unlimited source of energy. And if we can harness it, it will be the primary source of energy, certainly in the second half of the century and for many centuries to come.
Right. Well, that certainly spells out its appeal. It's a long way to get there, but you know, one day at a time, I guess. You said you don't create neutrons. Obviously, that's a good thing because even I know that you don't want them around and they're nasty little characters.
Well, the waste byproduct is helium, not radioactive, just helium. And the reason goes back again to no neutrons. So neutrons themselves, if it's not the spent fuel, it's other materials that neutrons would typically interact with. This applies both to fission and fusion. And when the neutrons interact with them, it might turn that material radioactive, which amounts to radioactive waste. Because we don't have neutrons, we have no harmful byproducts. it's just helium.
I'm not a chemist, but I've read articles saying that there's a shortage of helium in the world at the moment. So that's maybe a useful byproduct to have if you're going to have anything.
Absolutely. And as we turn off the exploration of gas, natural gas in the decarbonisation process, all helium comes from natural gas resources. It doesn't exist naturally other than that because it simply floats up into the atmosphere. So as we decarbonize and stop using gas, helium will become even more scarce.
Let's move to the next point of discussion, and that is, I'm no scientifically inclined fellow, but I watch things like the race to do quantum computing and industrialize that, and I see mentions of what you're trying to do and the competition around the world, and I think either of those things they've done on an industrial scale could change the world in profound ways. Is there any similarity in your eyes between what's going on in the race to build a useful quantum computer and the race to fusion with a net energy creation?
The short answer is yes. Going back to my days at ANFF, I had the privilege of sitting amongst the quantum computing groups around me, and using that facility were giving birth to the quantum computing industry that we have in Australia. In particular, Silicon Quantum Computing and DIRAC, the two companies spun out of UNSW. I'd always use quantum computing as a bit of a crystal ball for what might happen in fusion a few years later. So you're right, the similarities of high science, scientific risk, but huge value, which attracts the investor community at a very early stage, are very, very similar things. I think what's interesting now is both in fusion and also quantum computing, some of the companies that emerged have realized that their approaches don't work. So what that means, some of the better funded ones are pivoting to the supply chain. In fusion, First Light Fusion is a company who's recently announced in a very courageous way that their approach to fusion energy does not work. But with what they've built as a company, in particular amplified technology and some of their simulation capabilities, they're going to continue to service the fusion community. Same thing is happening in quantum computation.
This is a short interlude to again thank the sponsors that are making 2025's 50 Most Innovative campaign possible. Our appreciation goes out to these legends: Australia Wide Engineering Recruitment, TXM Lean Solutions, the Industry Capability Network, Bonfiglioli Australia, the Advanced Manufacturing Growth Centre, and the SmartCrete CRC. Now back to the show. Who are the leaders in fusion globally?
Well, to divide the industry up, there are two camps in fusion. There's magnetic fusion and there's laser fusion or inertial fusion. So magnetic fusion is actually quite mature. There's far more companies. The biggest fusion project and one of the biggest engineering projects in the world is ITER, which is the big fusion reactor in France. As fusion technology has developed, there's the scientific development and also the engineering development. The engineering development with magnetic fusion is far, far more advanced than it is for inertial fusion or laser fusion. But what's really interesting is in inertial fusion, the National Ignition Facility were the first facility to actually demonstrate net energy gain. So essentially, that's the proof of principle that fusion energy at large can be used as an energy source. So the fusion industry at the moment has magnetic fusion, very advanced engineering, but science that is still yet to demonstrate in a practical way that it can be achieved. And inertial fusion or laser fusion, which has proven that it works, but has far, far less mature engineering technology development around it. So the leaders in fusion, many of the magnetic fusion companies have announced that they are building what they claim to be the world's first fusion power plant, and this absolutely is a race. So Commonwealth Fusion System, Helium, Type 1 Energy, Pacific Fusion are some of those examples, and they've all raised many hundreds of millions to billions of dollars, and a lot of that from Australian investors as well, including our superannuation funds. In inertial fusion energy, the field is smaller. We were the first private company to be established in inertial or laser fusion energy. Other competitors, Exima Energy, they're essentially building big lasers as an enabling technology, and also Focus Energy, who have a similar approach to us, but using a different fuel.
Looking at some old stories about you guys and your progress, I saw one 3 years ago or so that mentioned you could do a material number of fusion reactions using your approach. What's the significance of that and what does it mean?
Well, 3 years ago, when we were cowboys, No one expected that laser fusion could produce energy. And it was a bold move for us to start trying to demonstrate that that works. And as I mentioned, Professor Hora had seen some experimental results showing that there were quite a large number of fusion reactions. Now, at that time, almost no companies had actually demonstrated any fusion in an experiment. They've built machines that reach high temperatures, that can sustain a plasma, that can operate a plasma for a certain amount of time, but very, very few had actually produced fusion. For us, literally our first experiment, we were able to get 10 to the 11 alpha particles from a laser shot. So that amounts to a Q being the scientific gain, which is the amount of fusion energy out divided by the amount of laser power that you use to generate it, of 0.01%. So what's significant about that, of course, it's not an energy gain, but it's orders of magnitude more than most other fusion efforts in the world, public or private, have achieved without billion-dollar investments to get there. So it was scientifically significant because we improved what we were expecting to achieve again, and that was, developing some understanding of the science. But it was also historical because it hadn't been done before, certainly not by any modern day company.
And you've mentioned lasers a few times, and on your nomination for our ongoing Australia's 50 Most Innovative Manufacturers campaign, you've also mentioned that you've begun a laser program last year in August. Why did this happen? What led up to it? And what does the program look like? What are you trying to achieve?
Based on our understanding of hydrogen boron fusion and how we can make it work, we do have a preconceptual design of a fusion power plant. The vast majority of that power plant is halls that contain massive lasers. And the reason for that is to ignite fusion, we need an enormous amount of energy to be put in before fusion happens and more energy comes out. So to drive that, we need enormous lasers. Ultimately, all the laser energy that we'd need in a pulse is well into the megajoules. Again, this is similar to what the National Ignition Facility did. What that means, if you imagine that a 1 gigawatt power plant might have several football field size lasers driving it, if we're to roll this out across the world, most of the capital investment into fusion power plants is actually going to be in the form of lasers and the buildings that those lasers are put in and the cooling systems required to run those lasers. So in order for us in the future to capture that value rather than just work out how to make fusion work, we're taking off down the path of developing lasers. Now, the lasers that we are initially looking at are not megajoule lasers. A megajoule laser is a huge behemoth of a laser, but we're developing smaller lasers that can be used for other applications. But in the context of a fusion power plant, one of these lasers would be a module which we can bind the beams to create, ultimately, the lasers with the power that we need to ignite fusion.
I guess people, myself included, are quite curious about what sort of stage you're at currently in terms of TRL or years from commercialisation, or whatever's the plainest way of putting it.
Surveying the industry, most people, companies and efforts around the world are expecting the first fusion energy to be on the grid in around about 10 years. Now, that is the source of debates and jokes and has been for a very, very long time. What's different now is that all of these efforts are getting results and there's significant investments going into them. So answering the question as a function of TRL, laser fusion, thanks to the National Ignition Facility, has reached TRL4, a practical demonstration of net energy gain. Of course, that has to be developed into something which can establish commercial fusion energy. HB11, we haven't done that. We need to build a very big facility just to demonstrate it. So we would be around the 2 to 3. Our laser technology is a lot further than that. We're TRL4 and rapidly increasing up the progress mark there. What's different compared to a lot of other or typical companies where you're developing a technology to make it work and ultimately sell it to customers is we're ultimately trying to sell to countries who have a national strategy and interest in building the world's first fusion power plant. It's kind of like the space race or even the race for commercial space flight that we saw Elon Musk win. So we essentially are the technology providers for that. And if we can show with the highest level of confidence that we can produce commercial fusion energy, we would expect that our technology would be the subject of, hopefully, the world's first fusion power plant.
You may or may not be able to answer this, but I got to ask, who are your investors, and are you able to say how much you've raised so far?
We have a range of investors between high net worth individuals, a few funds. Some of those are in Australia, some of those are overseas. There's probably not much point giving any more specific details than that. We have to thank the Australian Research Council and also Austrade for the R&D tax credit, which really is a significant investment into us. Add the cash elements of that up, we've raised about 11 million to date. That puts us on the lower end of the fusion companies that have been raising in the last 18 months.
So you're doing it on the cheap, basically?
We're doing it on the cheap. Australia is a good place to do it on the cheap. The US and other parts of the world are very, very expensive. But from the perspective of the milestones that we're achieving, we're absolutely punching above the weight of companies who've raised an order of magnitude higher amount of money than we have.
Another thing I saw while flicking through old media releases and stories is a number of international partnership announcements that you've made. I don't think that's weird when trying to develop something that's leading the world in anything. But does your progress really depend heavily on overseas facilities and collaborators? And does that mean that, there's potentially a lure to go overseas and that you might not be an Australian company in a few years?
So there's a few different answers there. I'll answer the first one as a function of investors. So the lure to move overseas really is a function of your investors. If most of your investors are overseas, that is what will lure you overseas. And likely you won't get lured back. And that's entirely because there's more money and more opportunities for growth. On the point of facilities are a little bit different. One of the beauties of laser fusion at large is we can do experiments. In contrast to magnetic fusion, where you have to build your own plasma device, they have to build a plasma device before they can get any results. Whereas there are international laser facilities around the world that we can pay for time or apply for time, do an experiment, develop our understanding, reduce the risk of the concept that we're developing. And we can use those on a fee-for-service basis. To date, we've done about 13 of those. And that's one of the reasons why we've been so successful. We can move fast because of these laser facilities. You mentioned ELI ERIC. Last year, I had the privilege of meeting Peter Pavel, the president of the Czech Republic, who was leading a trade delegation, including the director of ELI ERIC. So ELI ERIC is a consortium of laser facilities funded by the European Commission's infrastructure program, essentially to create high-tech jobs in Eastern Europe. So they have collectively the most advanced lasers in the world in Romania, Czech Republic, and Hungary. We signed a partnership agreement. They're interested in our laser work. They're interested in making the laser targets, which amount to our fuel, because the work that we've done has been world leading and they're interested to bring it in-house.
Do you want to say anything more about your efforts to commercialize what you're doing? You mentioned the laser side of things, but do you have any further plans to fusion as a service or charging for a black box that you plug in, or would you, license your technology? What's further than what you said already? What are the plans there?
Well, commercialization of laser fusion will be the birth of an industry. Actually, the construction of the first fusion power plant as a demonstrator will be the birth of an industry, as ITER has established industries in France and the UK. Where we fit into that, of course, we're the fusion developer developing the method of achieving fusion. The two ways we plan to commercialize that, we will be looking to license the system. We won't be looking necessarily to build it, but we will be looking to provide many of the components for the lasers, which is where most of the capital expenditure is. So our roadmap does include manufacturing these lasers, but also the fuels. We hope to establish the global fuel standard for hydrogen boron fuels. What that means is, I guess from the Australian context, what CSIRO did establishing the standard for Wi-Fi within their intellectual property portfolio, and then, essentially claiming the revenues for that once the world has commercialized it in other supply chains. We'll have the intellectual property portfolio and most comprehensive understanding of those fuels, which will be small pellets. And so that will be sold as a consumable to power plants. We will provide some of the lasers, which is the big capital expenditure item for the power plants, but also licensing many aspects of the design of the power plant.
One of the recurring questions in this series is what makes a company innovative? What's your opinion there?
Honestly, it's the courage to do something new. I've seen many, many manufacturing companies who are so busy looking after their existing customers that they don't have time to do anything else. And you ask the question, but when someone else does anything else, does that make you redundant? That's what I see as innovative. It really doesn't take that much work to try and claim some science that might have been done in a university, use your existing facilities to try and exploit that as a manufacturer, and then have a competitive advantage potentially globally but it does take some courage, time, and money to do that.
And so the closing question, and I'm keen to get your thoughts on this, as you've got, reasonably different background from most of our guests. What's the one issue within manufacturing that isn't getting the attention it deserves at the moment?
I'll give you the general question first, similar to my last answer, getting out of the comfort zone. I've seen many manufacturers who simply just don't have the knowledge or appetite even to actually go and try something new. And that's existing manufacturers adopting something else. But I think the other point is the next generation of manufacturing is not the same as the old generation of manufacturing. So the attention that manufacturing needs to get is this is not just using the notion of an industry, someone who's already established, to do something different. It actually involves the establishment of completely new companies with completely new capabilities, possibly with people who don't have a manufacturing background. And I think globally, that is something which doesn't get the attention that it deserves in Australia. Advanced manufacturing, real advanced manufacturing, is not the same as old manufacturing.
Yep. Well, that's a good note to end on, and I'm sure that's something for people to chew over on the drive home or whatever they do after they listen to this. It's been a pleasure speaking to you, Warren. Thanks for giving your time to us, and all the best.
Thanks for having me, Brent.